Our next session, The Evolution of Understanding, Universities and the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, will provide an opportunity for a fascinating conversation between two of the leaders of the higher education universe. We have Dr. Lawrence S. Bacow, president of Harvard University. We have Christopher L. Eisgruber, president of Princeton University. And their conversation will be moderated by the author and acclaimed essayist Dara Horn. So thank you so much for being with us. And Dara, the stage is yours.
I'm really excited to be here with Larry and Chris, who are both generously giving of their time today because of how important they felt this topic really was to publicly address. And for anyone who's just joining the symposium today, my first job is to disappoint our audience by telling you that this conversation will not include an audience Q&A, but hopefully we will cover a lot of what's on everyone's minds. So I want to thank Larry and Chris for offering to join us today, and I'm really excited to be here with you. I thought we could start really with the personal. You both are really deeply connected to Jewish life yourselves, and for each of you, it's more than just a heritage. I thought, Larry, we could start with you. Can you just tell us about your own connection to Jewish identity and how it informs your work?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Dara, for agreeing to act as our host this afternoon, but also thanks to the Center for Jewish History. This is an important topic, I think, for all of us. Anti-Semitism was actually the defining experience in both of my parents' lives. My father was born in Minsk. He came to this country to escape the pogroms of Eastern Europe before World War II. My mother was born and raised in Germany, and sadly, she was the only member of her family who survived the war. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was the only member of her family, actually the only member of her town to have survived the war as well. So this topic is one which I think it's important that we focus on. It's important that we not lose sight of it. And for me, the experience of my parents actually serves as a reminder of why we need to be attentive to these issues.
Chris, I know you've got an interesting personal connection that I know has informed your approach to this. If you could tell us about that, we'd be delighted to hear it.
Yes, Dara, and let me start off like Larry, both by thanking you for agreeing to moderate the panel and thanking the Center for Jewish History for including me on the panel about this important topic. My own story is that I discovered late in life that I was Jewish after finding that my mother, who had come over to the United States at age 8 in 1940, escaping the Holocaust in Germany, was Jewish. She suppressed her Jewish identity from the time she left high school and went to college. Because I discovered all of this only after her death, I never had a chance to find out her reasons why, but I think it was because she believed that anti-Semitism made it very dangerous to be Jewish in the world. And after coming to this country and growing up here, decided that she wanted to suppress all of those connections and felt that was a necessary thing to protect her children and her family. I have to say, it has been a tremendously rewarding and enriching experience for me to discover my Jewish identity and to get to know a family and a set of relatives whom I didn't know existed. And it gives me, I want to say, one other reason for being grateful to the Center for Jewish History, because I would not have found my family, and particularly my relatives in Israel, without the benefit of the archives at CJH. So it gives me a special reason to be grateful to have a chance to be on this panel.
So this is really fascinating that really, in a sense, both of your lives are, and your family's lives have been in some ways shaped not just by Judaism, but by anti-Semitism and fighting against it. Larry, you've spoken about Jewish tradition being, I think it was in your words, really too valuable to keep to oneself or too valuable to keep within the Jewish community. you shared with me the example of how you would use the words of the ancient Rabbi Ben Zoma in your convocation for a freshman recently. I'm curious because both of your institutions, of course, are very atypical. This is the elephant in the room when you talk to the president of Harvard and Princeton. Not just because of your, the status and the resources you have, but also because you also have really robust Jewish communities among students and faculty and alumni. So I'm curious how you see the role of institution like yours in teaching that culture and tradition. And how your institutions investigate and share that culture as part of a larger commitment to the humanities. And maybe Larry, we could start with you since I gave that example from your convocation.
Well, I do think it's the teachings of our tradition are too important to keep to ourselves. But more than that, I think that where we find thriving Jewish communities on college campuses, it's often the case that these communities are places where not just Jewish students can find opportunities to learn and to gather, but to do so in a context which are welcoming to others as well. And in some ways, I think the easiest way to combat anti-Semitism actually is to create robust places where interchange can occur between Jews and non-Jews alike. It turns out on Friday night, Adele and I had Shabbat dinner with the Jewish Law Students Association at Harvard Law School. And it was interesting. This is actually co-sponsored by Chabad at Harvard. And there were probably 250 to 300 students who were there. And not all of them were Jewish. I mean, it was an environment which welcomes others. And I think that, just listening to the last panel a bit, I think that's another strategy which we need to employ more, is to find opportunities to bring different communities together. It's much harder, I think, to stand and articulate principles that are anathema to Jews if you actually know Jewish classmates in a deep way and are familiar with their traditions as well.
Chris, how does that look on your campus?
So I think it's very similar here. And Dara, as you said, we're fortunate to have a thriving community now at Princeton of students, faculty, and alumni. Obviously, that was not always the case, especially so at my institution, which had a deserved, I'm afraid, reputation for anti-Semitism for a long period of time. I'm very proud and personally delighted that has changed. And as Larry described at Harvard, so too at Princeton, we're fortunate to have a very strong Princeton Hillel under the leadership of Rabbi Julie Roth, and a very strong Chabad community under the leadership of Rabbi Eitan Webb. And they bring students together, again, within the Jewish community and beyond it, and are very constructive at mediating these conversations that need to take place. I also think it's important, and Dara, I think you mentioned the humanities in particular, that we have teaching going on in the classrooms, both about anti-Semitism, which was the subject of the last panel, and about Jewish life, and about the politics of and history of Judaism in the world. We have a number of strong people doing that, and a number of important institutional commitments. So one example is that our alum Len Milberg gave a chair in American Jewish Studies to the university. The holder of that chair right now is Professor Esther Shore, who's a professor of English and is also the director of our Humanities Council. And I mention that because it provides the kind of leadership that I think is felt not only in a particular faculty member's classes, but helps to make sure that the importance of this aspect of cultural diversity, as others, are highlighted in our curriculum.
Chris, I wanted to bring up something that you had brought up with me, which is that one of the ways we see sometimes anti-Semitism manifest in university settings is often what's called anti-Zionism, or conversations around anti-Zionism that become very vitriolic. And I know you brought this up with me as something essential to address. You've addressed it a bit in your scholarship. I was wondering, how does one effectively address this issue on campus and also beyond it? And of course, I'm going to ask both of you this question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is at least one of the nerves of the anti-Semitic incidents that we now see on campuses. The statement that I put out in late May of last year was in response to of the last academic year, was in response to a couple of incidents that occurred on our campus where identifiably Jewish students were either, in one case, praying outside of our Center for Jewish Life, or in another case, simply walking along the street in Princeton. And passersby heckled them. We think these were people not affiliated with the university, but they heckled them by shouting pro-Palestinian slogans at them, which was a reflection of the debate over Zionism, but in a way that was clearly anti-Semitic in its manifestation. And the reason I think this is such a tender nerve is there are questions here, right? Important questions that have to be discussed in the right way on a college campus, and we have to have commitments to that. So you mentioned that I have addressed this in my scholarship. The last article I wrote before becoming president and finding myself too busy to do the scholarship that I love was a comparative analysis of religious freedom done with my co-author, Larry Sager from the University of Texas. And one of the questions we were asking in that piece was, how can you be, as a nation, dedicated to being a homeland and also be dedicated to the principle of equal membership? A combination that I think is present very explicitly in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And when you have a question like that, there are both theoretical issues about how to reconcile and whether you can reconcile the idea that one people is special and that all people have equal membership, and then very practical questions about what that means in the hotly contested circumstances of the Middle East. And we have to have those conversations on college campuses. We know they're going to be emotional. We know they're going to be passionate. Sometimes they're going to be uninformed, and people are going to say things that are just wrong. And those conversations have to continue. But we also have to be aware of circumstances where they include anti-Semitic elements and respond to those. And we have to be moving them through things like conversations at places like Hillel or Chabad, or in the classroom, or through things when it's appropriate that I say in directions that are more constructive. But I think the difficulty of those questions, the emotion around those questions, the contested definitions of anti-Semitism around those questions make this one of the most sensitive and tender places for the discussion of these topics, and one of the most important.
Larry, I know that this is something you've grappled with too. You shared with me an example of this issue coming up during your time at Tufts. Can you tell us about that, and also, what you find effective in dealing with this issue?
So, well, first, I agree completely. And universities are places where, on any topic where reasonable people can differ, the function of a university is actually to create a place for dialogue, a place where people can contest and discover truth, reveal it. And it's important that we do that. That said, we also have to recognize that we're a microcosm of the larger world that we live in. And everything that's unpleasant in the larger world, to a certain extent, you'll find on a university campus. And that includes racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and all sorts of other things. So I think we need to acknowledge that, first of all. But second, that in situations where reasonable people can differ, it's important to push back against those who would suggest that the university ought to adopt one position or another, because that certainly doesn't encourage debate. In fact, it quashes it. Now, having said that, it's also the case that in the context of these heated debates, emotional debates, as Chris describes, debates in which people bring their own lived experience, and on both of our campuses, we have students who've grown up in Palestinian refugee camps, and we have Israeli students who've served in the IDF and have had different kinds of experiences. In that context, it's, at least I found it rarely helpful to label people with whom you disagree with by sort of challenging a position which, let's face it, many of us would find comfortable espousing by sort of saying, well, you're anti-Semitic if you disagree with me, because at that point, the conversation comes to an end. And so we have to look for ways to avoid it, recognizing that there are times in which people clearly are being anti-Semitic, and that also has to be called out. But this is it's a difficult boundary to navigate, to figure out how we can have these conversations, but without necessarily labeling people in ways that bring the conversation to an end. The story that I shared with you was during my time as president of Tufts. I don't mind repeating it here. Very early on, This is when the BDS movement was actually first getting started. And there was a petition that was circulating, on the Harvard, Tufts, and MIT campuses, the three institutions that I've been affiliated with my entire life. So maybe I'm to blame, who's to know? But I was surprised. Well, first of all, I should point out that this petition was never actually presented to either Larry Summers, who was president of Harvard at the time, Chuck Vest, who was president of MIT at the time, or to me as president of Tufts. It existed on the web, but it was never actually presented to any of us, which I thought was sort of interesting. But I went online and I took a look at who signed it at Tufts. And I was surprised when I found a very prominent and thoughtful member of our faculty. I quietly called him up, somebody who I enjoyed a terrific relationship with. And I said, I was surprised to see your name here. And he said, well, I'm frustrated. Look what's going on in the Middle East. This is unfair. And I wanted to express my frustration. And I said, I recognize that. I acknowledge it. But, if the university were to adopt the position that you've suggested that we do, again, the conversation would come to an end. And then I asked him, did you protest against the Vietnam War? And he said, yes, I did. And I said, how would you have felt? Because the petition was urging us to do a variety of things. How would you have felt back then if you had been prohibited from attending an academic conference because your government had adopted a position that you yourself disagreed with? So I think, at times it's important that we engage, even as presidents, that we engage with people on this issue. We have to be very, very careful how we do so, however. Because both Chris and I have to deal with what a colleague of mine calls the presidential amplification factor. When we weigh in on an issue, it's different than when anybody else weighing in on our campus. I was only able to do this in this particular case because of the relationship I had with this particular faculty member, who, I might add, agreed that he was wrong and took his name off the petition. A small
well, so I mean, it does sound like it's the idea of open dialogue is really the key here, and and also as a model of what universities can present, and also as a model of and keeping those relationships open, as you said, knowing these people, having the real relationships in place. I think we can say that universities are producing scholarship and modeling dialogue and those kinds of things, but of course, as Chris mentioned earlier, both of your institutions have these long histories of being at the top of the scholarly world and modeling this kind of whatever was considered open dialogue at the time, but still being able to do so while promoting anti-Semitism and other bigotries. I'm curious how you confront that history on your campuses, and not just like how you confront it, like, changing the name of the Woodrow Wilson School, but also like in a deeper way and sort of realizing like, as Chris, I think you said publicly, like these institutions have been wrong in the past. It's possible that we're wrong now about a lot of things. How do you sort of, bridge that gap between like being at the height of the scholarship and dialogue in these, prestigious institutions, but knowing that like, you also could be judged wrong in the future? So maybe we'll start with Chris.
Okay. I think that attitude, right, knowing that you could be judged wrong in the future, is fundamental to what we do as academics and educational institutions, period. And in recent years, we have faced, I think, strong urgings, increasing exhortation and pressure to make sure that we are turning that lens on our own history as well as on the rest of the world. And I think that's a healthy thing for us to do. So I think it is important for us to be sponsoring research into what we do and have done as institutions, to be asking hard questions about it, to be asking hard questions about the attitudes that underlie the research that we're doing right now, right? Some people are critical of some of those directions. And we have to be doing that in the way that we talk about the institution when I talk about it, for example, as well as through the work of our scholars whom I mentioned earlier. One of the things that we've done here, and my guess is that Harvard has done similar things, is we've had a series of conferences around groups that have suffered the effects of exclusion at our university and in American society and the world in the past. And we had a conference here, again, co-sponsored with the leadership of Hillel and the Center for Jewish Life a few years back, called L'Chaim, a celebration of Jewish life at Princeton that dated back to Einstein's presence on this campus. He was, among his many other virtues, a seminal figure in enriching Jewish life at Princeton. And that brought back a lot of our alumni to talk about the history of what it was to be Jewish at Princeton, the things to be proud of, and the things that we as an institution deeply regret and were difficult for people. And I think being open about those histories and encouraging people to do the kind of rigorous scholarly work that define our institutions is the way that we continue to push ourselves to get better.
Larry?
You know, as the last panel showed us, I mean, one of the reasons why we study history is not only to understand the past, but to inform the present and to chart the future. And I think we do need to be candid and honest and open about our past. You know, I shared with you an essay about the history of anti-Semitism at Harvard and the history of quotas, which I'm not proud to say, but one of my predecessors, Lawrence Lowell, was you know, one of the first to institute quotas on Jews at Harvard. And you know, sadly, Harvard did it, so others followed us. You know, Lowell himself led the effort to keep Brandeis off the Supreme Court. He made it difficult, if not impossible, for Blacks to live in Harvard Yard. He conducted secret trials to try and purge Harvard College of homosexual students at the time. You know, one could say he was an equal opportunity bigot. But it's important that we acknowledge that past. It's important that we do so, not just because that's who we were back then, but to demonstrate that we can grow, we can move beyond it. But I also think there's a subtler message there. And that is that not just institutions don't always get it right, university presidents do not always get it right. I always say to those who would like me to speak out on more issues that, you know, I don't know about Chris, but I don't think I got any smarter when I was named president of Harvard. You know, ask me something that I know about and I'll speak on that issue. But, you know, university presidents have been wrong in the past. If I read my email, I know there are many who think I'm wrong in the present. But we need to be modest again about our capacity to chart a course which is, quote, always right. We're fallible like anybody else. We receive criticism, we're often worthy of it, but that's also what it means to be part of a community which is committed really to truth. Truth needs to be contested, it needs to be revealed. And that can only happen through vigorous debate.
So let's go to the bigger picture then. You know, of course, today's conference is a lot about what institutions like yours can offer as solutions to like this larger problem beyond the campus, right? Not just about, you know, things that are going on the campus, but in the larger society. Like, what are some things that universities can contribute to this larger, you know, fight against anti-Semitism? Like, what have you found like actually works, and what are some concrete possibilities for how we can universities can contribute to this battle? So whoever wants to start, I don't know. I guess we'll go back to Chris.
So Dara, first of all, I think the panelists on the panels preceding this one have done a great job of illustrating many of the things that can be done. And again, it's been a terrific conference in that regard. I'd say a couple of things about this. One is, first of all, I just think as this entire conference illustrates, institutions in general, put aside the question of what they can do in the short term, are very important to the response to anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. We live in a time when kind of the urgency of short-term issues has created a certain kind of caustic response to institutions in general. And people are often looking or evaluating institutions on the basis of whether or not they're taking the right position on some political issue of importance to them. Having these institutions that, as Larry said, are dedicated to seeking truth, to being impartial over time, to the fair treatment of individuals and issues, that's important in and of itself to responding to, I think, the root causes of many different kinds of hate. Beyond that, I would say look, what we do fundamentally is both to produce truth-seeking scholarship. That's very important, including about questions such as Jewish life, Jewish history, the history of anti-Semitism, and the political thought around anti-Semitism. We educate students not simply for their professions, but to have the skills of citizenship, including an ability to contribute to and participate in institutions and to be able to engage in critical thinking. And those are always going to be the main ways in which we contribute. I do think, and I agree entirely with Larry's statements about why people like he and I should be reticent about when we're going to go out and say things. But as both of us have illustrated by what we've done, there are times when we just have to speak up for values in a time when the expression of hate has become far more public and common on a number of dimensions than I would have anticipated. It's important that people be standing up for things that we might have thought in the past went without saying. They don't go without saying. We have to say them, and we will keep doing that.
And I would agree with that completely. I would also note that both Chris and I actually within a few days of each other put out statements of anti-Semitism, about anti-Semitism, motivated by different events on each of our campuses. But what I thought was interesting is that each of us grounded our statements in our own personal narratives and experiences. I ended mine by saying that my parents came to this country in search of religious freedom and opportunity, and they found it. And we owe no less to anybody else. And that's a responsibility that all of us bear. And so I think at times being able to speak to these issues, but to tie them back to our own personal experience and narrative, helps to underscore the fact that this is not just an anodyne statement that either one of us are issuing. I agree completely that we influence the world in the end through our teaching, through our scholarship. We also do it, I would say, because of the nature of our institutions, by trying to, chart a path that might be pursued by others. That said, the media probably pays far too much attention to what goes on. I'll at least speak on my own campus, Chris. I don't know about yours. I think the world would be a better place if people paid less attention to what happens at Harvard. But from time to time, the fact that we are who we are gives us the capacity to stand up and speak to certain important issues, like the important role that this country has traditionally played in welcoming immigrants and, in fact, refugees. We went to bat to admit a Palestinian student who was turned away at Logan Airport by Immigration and Natural Resources, Immigration, when he attempted to enter this country to attend Harvard College as a freshman. And, the entire university mobilized its resources to try and ensure that he could come back and study here. It got a lot of attention nationwide, but sadly, the story repeated itself at lots of other campuses that didn't have the resources that we do to try and turn this around. That's an example of when I think it helps to be a place like Harvard or Princeton. I will also say that, there are good ideas that are occurring on every campus for how to do things. When I was at Tufts, Hillel there had a terrific idea for how to teach the lessons of the Holocaust in ways that would engage more than just the Jewish community. They created a program called Moral Voices, which each year would bring someone to campus who would successfully raise a moral voice in response to injustice somewhere in the world. And this person would come and give a major lecture, which would fill the largest auditorium at Tufts with students from from across the university. They would be in residence usually for the course of the week. Our Hillel rabbi would actually invite them to teach Torah with them, even though typically they weren't Jewish. But I think there are creative ways that we can engage the next generation about these issues. Teaching young people how to raise a moral voice in response to injustice is, I think, one of the best defenses that we have for dealing with injustice, whether or not it is aimed at Jews or anyone else.
So, Larry, in talking about concrete solutions to this, first of all, we've all talked about modeling dialogue and modeling that kind of, elevating those kinds of voices that are making these, bold statements. It seems like one big contributor to anti-Semitism is really the spread of misinformation, especially online today. And of course, we talked about that a little bit in other sessions today. Larry, I know there's work going on at Harvard in law and even computer science sort of to address that. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about that. And Chris, I know there are some scholarly initiatives at Princeton also addressing these like deeper social problems, that contribute to anti-Semitism, like misinformation and political polarization. I was surprised in speaking with you in advance of this conversation that I'm a fairly educated person. I'm an alum of some of these institutions. I had never heard about these. I'd love if you could tell people about what's been going on in your campuses in that sense in terms of changing the conversation.
We're proud to claim you as an alum, Dara, not just once, but twice. Harvard College and PhD. There's lots of work that goes on, and there's probably some that I'm not even aware of, but at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School on Internet and Society, we have people there literally working on software and programs to be able to rapidly identify misinformation on the web and characterize it as such. At the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School, which focuses on the media, there are similar kinds of efforts as well. We have people who are doing important work on algorithmic bias and how it is that certain machine learning algorithms tend to emphasize build on certain phrases and drive people to content which is not terribly useful from a larger societal perspective that we're encouraging people to go to certain sites. So this is work that's not just being done at Harvard. I think it's done by, in every major computer science department at the moment. We also have, faculty members. We have an interesting program that's now being picked up in a lot of other universities, but it started at Harvard, and I'm quite proud of it. It's called Embedded Ethics, in which we have philosophy graduate students who are embedded in mainstream computer science courses, where their job working with the instructor is to be able to sort of tease out the implied or embedded ethical issues that are raised in certain problem sets, as students are asked, in fact, to develop algorithms and things to do certain things, and how those algorithms may have unintended second-order consequences. So there's a tremendous amount of work like this going on right now, literally in every computer science department and lots of other places throughout the country. It's still relatively new, and like all new ideas, it takes a while for ideas to gain traction, to become ideas in good currency, to be adopted routinely as parts of the curriculum. But one of the great things about American higher education is that we have so many different kinds of institutions, and we compete in every possible dimension, and that competition is actually good because it drives innovation. And one of the ways it drives innovation is in curricular innovation and innovation in research. And, faculty will, go to anything that interests them or anything that they think will work better than what they're doing now in many cases. So, we're learning from many other places as well.
Chris, what kind of initiatives do you have going on at Princeton in this regard?
I think as Larry alluded to, in some ways the initiatives sound quite similar, right? Because I do agree with him that there is work of this kind going on right now at universities throughout the country because the questions are so interesting and so urgent, right? So we have our Center for Information and Technology Policy, which is very concerned with some of these questions about how it is that social media or artificial intelligence or other kinds of recent developments may be contributing to the disinformation that exists right now. My colleagues, because this is where my faculty appointment was and is in the University Center for Human Values, we're deeply concerned with questions of ethics and citizenship and how it is that we educate students as citizens. I think rather than saying more about what's happening at Princeton on our campus, maybe I'll just add to that by saying, I think there are some projects that are very distinctive taking place at other universities. I would call out, for example, the Shoah Project at the University of Southern California, which I just think was such an extraordinary thing to do in order to create a record of testimonies as the generation that experienced the Holocaust and can report on it vanishes from the earth, right? That is an extraordinary thing that USC and the Shoah Center have done. I'll also note that some of the most important contributions that any of our institutions make will be through our alumni as they move out into the world, and use that as a moment to cavil a bit about Maria Ressa, our undergraduate alumnus who was honored with a Nobel Prize this week, not with regard to anti-Semitism, but for working on, in circumstances of oppression and inequality, combating misinformation by creating a new form of journalistic network dedicated to truth. I mean, some of this, in terms of getting information out there, is going to depend on our alumni and people who move beyond the university community rather than the projects that we're doing here.
And we're quite proud of the fact that Maria is a fellow at Harvard.
And you should be. She's wonderful.
She is.
Should turn this into like a boxing match between the two of you. Larry, you've spoken about sort of distinguishing between truth, facts, and falsehood, and also between like problems and conditions. And I think the distinction you made was like problems are things we can actually solve, whereas conditions are things we figure out better ways to live with. And I believe you had characterized anti-Semitism in the latter category, which is dismaying, but probably true. I'm wondering, like, how do you? I mean, is this like a completely unsolvable problem? I mean, if people at your institutions can't solve it, maybe that's true. If so, like, what are the most effective ways of addressing this kind of, if it's not a problem, a condition?
Well, again, I find this distinction useful because I think to frame it as a problem suggests that we're going to, one day we're going to figure things out and we're going to find a solution and rid the world entirely of anti-Semitism. And I think, look, we have literally thousands of years of experience in dealing with it. And I think it's probably naive to imagine that it will go away any more than racism will disappear from the face of the earth. One of the things which we've learned by in neuroscience is that, some of these prejudices are, at least with respect to racism, deeply embedded, neurologically. And what that says to me is that we need to find ways of managing these things, dealing with them, responding to them. And again, the distinction that I find useful between problems and conditions is that, a problem is susceptible to a solution. You solve the problem, it goes away. A condition, if you ignore it, can kill you. But if you manage it long term, you can live with it. You can live with it quite well. And I think one of the things, again, I want to go back to a comment I made earlier, that our institutions, every college or university campus is a microcosm of the world that we live in. And every year, we go through this process of welcoming a new group of students into our institutions, and not just new students, but new faculty, new staff, often from literally around the world, who come in, who bring different, let's face it, prejudices and biases and cultural norms to our campus. And so things which, many of us would sort of find objectionable, abhorrent, we'd sort of say, no, we don't do that, in different cultures are accepted in ways. And part of what it means to live in a multicultural environment is to find opportunities for people to learn from each other, but also to establish norms and expectations. That's why I say this work is never done. It is work that I think we should expect that we have to keep at it. And if we do, we can manage it and we can live with it and we can keep it under control. But I would like to be more of an optimist and think that someday the world will be rid of it. But sadly, I don't see it happening in my lifetime.
I'm going to guess that Chris is going to agree with that.
Yeah, I would just say amen to that. I think that, Larry, I agree with everything Larry said. He put it very well. So I'm not going to try to add to that wisely.
Sure. Well, so listen, I think there's this caricature we often see about campus culture as like a lockstep ideology. That's something that the media loves to talk about all the time. But it seems to me that, ideological thinking, like on both ends of the political spectrum, often can contribute to anti-Semitism, because extreme ideologies flatter people who, want to think that they're, victims of somebody else who's wielding some kind of power beyond their control or something. I'm curious if you feel like that stereotype is at all true, or the larger question of, like, what are universities like yours doing to sort of contribute to a culture of more critical thinking, independent thinking, non-ideological thinking, when we are in this, now social situation where you have these like ideological silos online and increasingly in real life. And maybe, Chris, we can start with you.
Dara, again, I think Larry and I would agree that creating an environment of constructive, critical, truth-seeking discussion and conversation is what we do as universities, and almost every aspect of our enterprise is aimed at that. I think at times you talk about what the kind of perceptions are out there. We're living in a fraught, polarized time. Our students are having to deal with a set of crises exemplified by the threats to our planet and sustainability, high levels of inequality, a siege of the United States Capitol as we had our presidential transition. These are difficult times for anybody to go through, and you mentioned the pandemic in the course of that, right? And it's certainly difficult for someone who's just growing up to experience all of this and try to navigate that. And so you're going to have a lot of activism on college campuses. You're going to have strong opinions expressed on either side. As someone who has the privilege and the opportunity to live on one of these campuses and lead a campus, I'm proud of the kind of conversations that take place here. I know that in our environment, right, the most outrageous things are going to get amplified. If I go, as I did at the beginning of last week, and sit down with 26 students as the president of the university, or Larry goes and attends Shabbat dinner, that's not likely to become a story in any of the national newspapers. But if somebody on the campus says something outrageous or ideological, or there's a kind of eruption of some kind, that will be. And I think those things are part of campus life, but are done through our classrooms, through our kind of extracurricular institutions, through the leadership that Larry and I and others try to provide, is to channel those kinds of strong feelings, opinions, and emotions in more constructive directions. And I think we do.
Can I just add,
Yeah.
I agree with Chris completely. I would also add that I think our best defense against this in the end is a liberal education. Teaching students how to think critically, especially in a world in which technology has disintermediated the editorial function, in which anybody can publish any idea that they want. Far more important even today for students to be able to differentiate the signal from the noise. And that is, I would argue, ultimately the function of a liberal education.
This has been fantastic. I want to thank both of you for giving us your time today, but also for all your work in fostering those kinds of conversations on your campuses and creating an environment where students have an opportunity to really search for truth and disseminate that truth in the wider society. So thank you both so much for participating today. It's been a real pleasure to hear from both of you.
Thank you. Thank you for your own good work on these subjects.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dara. And I want to thank our distinguished university professors for sharing with us their time, their experience, and their thoughts. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm Bernie Michael. I am the CEO and president of the Center for Jewish History. I want to thank some of the many people and organizations that made today's program possible. First of all, I want to thank the David Berg Foundation and its president, Michelle Tachi, and the Leon Levy Foundation and its founding trustee, Shelby White, for their generous support as lead funders of today's program and for their vision and guidance throughout. I also want to thank JMU's and its president, Michael Glickman, our co-sponsor and producer for today's event. I want to give a special thanks to our board chair, Peter Baldwin, for his leadership and support of this entire effort and for all we do here at the center. And of course, I want to thank all of the wonderful speakers at today's program for sharing with us their ideas and insight. Finally, I'd like to thank our wonderful staff here at the center for their tireless work in helping to pull this symposium together. And I also want to thank our partner organizations for their efforts in this event. We started this symposium with the recognition that a problem exists. Anti-Semitism is on the rise precipitously here in America and around the world. From dramatic and horrific events at Pittsburgh and Poway, to people marching with torches in Charlottesville, to a Texas school board that asked that school books on the Holocaust be balanced with books that show the so-called opposing views, to the corrosive effect of intimidation of Jews on college campuses around the country and around the world, to the desecration of Jewish cemeteries and houses of worship. In the face of all of these dangerous facts, we naturally try to make sense of it all. We ask questions. We started this symposium with a question: can ideas change history? What can museums, archives, libraries, and cultural institutions do to confront anti-Semitism? From these straightforward and deceptively simple questions came more questions, more ideas, more pathways to confront and combat anti-Semitism. Today, you heard from some of the great practitioners and thinkers in the field, sharing their ideas on how we came to this point and how to stand up to the hideous and toxic disease of rampant anti-Semitism. We hope that what we have all heard today will engage a new generation of thinkers and doers, that it will inspire new strategies and new tactics, that it will precipitate new and visionary philanthropy in the area, all with the goal of working the problem. We will not erase centuries of anti-Semitism with a single symposium. We will not be the first or the last generation to see the dangers of anti-Semitism and search for a way to confront and combat its evil. As a child of Holocaust survivors, this resonates with me deeply. I know that we must all push back on this rise of hate and not tolerate a world in which anti-Semitism becomes normalized. We need to push back on ignorance with education, push back on lies with facts. These are just some of the issues, the ideas, and the problems that we work every day here at the Center for Jewish History. Convening programs that bring together diverse thinkers with unique and innovative ways of approaching problems, that's what makes the center a special place and an indispensable part of the path forward. We are an archive and fact-based institution, something that is essential in a world in which truth is being attacked daily. The center and institutions like it must come together now to stand tall and push back against this scourge. In the darkest of hours, we must join together to confront anti-Semitism. We hope that you will join with us here at the center to share your ideas and to be a part of the path away from these troubling times. I urge you to go to cjh.org to learn more and to give your support. If we started this program with a simple question, it seems appropriate altogether that we end it with a simple question. What will you do now? How will you engage and be part of the path forward? We hope you will join with us. On behalf of all of us here at the Center for Jewish History, thank you.